We left off in our study of 1 Samuel last week with David on the run. That kind of seems to be David's normal at this point in 1 Samuel. He has just been perpetually on the run from Saul. Saul just has like tunnel vision in these chapters with trying to take David out. Last week I asked you to think about what it would be like for David to be a fugitive, to imagine what it would have been like to be on the run from Saul. I mean, think about how stressful it would be to constantly be having to look over your shoulder as someone is hunting you every single day. I mean, you're probably thinking to yourself, can I start a fire tonight? Am I going to give away my position? You're probably imagining that Saul is just over every hilltop or behind every cluster of trees. You're thinking to yourself, maybe I can't stay in one area for too long in case he finds me. Maybe you're thinking about having to get even your basic necessities like food or water in the dark, lest one of his spies or Saul himself sees you. I mean, this way of life just has to be so stressful, exhausting. Saul actually, we didn't get to this last week, but Saul actually gets really close to finding David. He ends up in the exact same cave as him. You remember David and his men are hiding in the far reaches of the cave when Saul comes in by himself, and you can almost hear David's men whispering to David, David, this is your chance. Go get him. The Lord's just put him in front of you. Go take out your enemy. Does David kill Saul? No, he doesn't. He only sneaks up to him and takes off a corner of his garment, comes back to his men, talks them out of killing Saul, and he refers to Saul as the Lord's anointed. David refuses to put out his hand to kill the Lord's anointed. Again, we didn't talk about this last week. We ran out of time, but I'm curious if you guys could weigh in on what you think it means when David refers to Saul in this way. What is David communicating about Saul when he says, I will not touch the Lord's anointed? Any ideas? Barb? Okay, that Saul is a part of God's plan. Yeah, Diane?
I was going to say the same thing. God planned everything for Saul to do.
Okay, Christine?
God chose.
God chose Saul. Yeah, God was using Saul as part of his plan. I think David recognizes that this is the man that God had chosen or appointed to be king. And David is thinking to himself, if God chose him to be king, it is not my job to end his kingship. If God can determine the start date of Saul's reign, I will trust God to determine the end date. I'm not going to take matters into my own hands and do whatever I think is good in my eyes. I'm going to trust God here. We'll encounter this a little bit later today. But I wanted us to begin this morning where our reading plan started, here in 1 Samuel chapter 25, and it kind of presents a bit of a break in the story between the interactions that Saul and David are having with one another, and we're introduced to some new characters in the scripture by the name of Abigail and Nabal. They are a husband and wife duo or tandem that have very different interactions with David. They are almost polar opposites. As I was thinking about it this week, I thought to myself, man, the only explanation that I have for how these two people got married is arranged marriage. That's the only thing that makes sense to me, because I just don't see how these people could have come together otherwise. And if you think I'm making too much about their character, I don't really think I am. The text actually makes it a point to tell us certain things about their character. And this is our first question this morning. I asked you to write a character description of the following people from this chapter. So you guys just tell me, we'll start with Nabal here. What are some of the things that the text explicitly says about his character? Yeah, Andy.
He was very rich, harsh, badly behaved, selfish. He refused to feed people.
Yeah, that was pretty good. I think you even maybe quoted verse 3 right there. Harsh and badly behaved, selfish, refused to feed other people. Yeah, any other words come to mind? Brenda? Foolish. You nailed another component of his. We're told that his name actually means fool or folly. Diane? Okay, you're going to say fool. Any other thoughts about Nabal, what he was like? Kip? He was a worthless fellow. Yeah, verse 17 says that he is such a worthless man that one can't even speak to him. Yeah, he also insulted David. Andy pointed out that he refused to feed David. Yeah, in contrast, how about Abigail? How is she described in these chapters? Brenda?
Very wise.
Wise? Yeah. Kaylee? Discerning? Yeah, I believe it's verse 3 as well, presents the contrast. Abigail is discerning and beautiful, but her husband is harsh and badly behaved. Andy, what else? She's generous. Yeah. Yeah, she did what her husband refused to do. She fed David when her husband wouldn't. Yeah, let me just explain what's going on in this chapter to kind of get the full picture of, we've talked about their character, now let's dive into the story here. Towards the beginning of the chapter, David hears that Nabal is shearing his sheep. Now, I read this week that sheep shearing would take place twice a year, and it was kind of a cause for celebration. If you think about it from a shepherd's perspective, this is how you get your income or your wealth, by shearing your sheep. So it's not too hard to imagine then that on these 2 occasions a year, you're pulling in all this wealth. Hey, let's celebrate. This is a time for rejoicing and excess. We know about Nabal that he was a very wealthy man. He had something like 3,000 sheep. I have it down here in my notes. 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. I mean, Nabal is raking it in from our perspective at this time of year. And so David catches wind of this, and he sends a delegation to Nabal and says, hey, can you feed me and my men? Whatever's on hand, could you make available to us? Now, at first glance, that does seem to strike us as a pretty bold request on David's part. Remember that he's not asking to just feed himself, one person. He's asking David to supply food. He's asking Nabal to supply food for 600 men, right? If you or I were asked today to maybe add a couple of people to our table for lunch, we could make do. We might pull something out of the freezer. We might take smaller portions. We'd make it happen. But if someone said, hey, can you have 600 people over for lunch? We'd be like, oh my goodness. We'd feel pretty put upon. We would think, yikes, I don't know if I can do that. And so given our perspective about this request, we might be inclined to take sides with Nabal in this story. We might actually understand Nabal's response when he says to David, you want me to take my food and water that I have set aside for my workers and give it to you guys? There's a part of us that understands what Nabal is saying here. We're like, yeah, I can kind of understand how you might be a little irked by this. However, we need to be careful to let the text shape the way that we think about Nabal's response to David. I want to point out a couple of things to you. First, David wasn't making this request at random. He didn't just, kind of look at everyone that was shearing their sheep and say, Nabal, I'm going to pick you to have to feed my entire army. No. We find out here in this chapter that David and his men had actually performed a service to Nabal. They had guarded his flocks while they were grazing in the wilderness. I want you to think about being a shepherd for just a minute and how vulnerable of a job that might be. I mean, we know from David's own example that lions and bears had no problem coming in and trying to snatch a sheep for themselves. Hey, that's a quick meal, right? Think about if you're a shepherd, maybe just yourself in charge of a whole flock, maybe just you and a couple of other guys, and if a roving band of warriors were to come along and they were hostile towards you, how easy would it be for them to kill you and take the sheep for themselves? But we're told that David and his 600 men actually kind of guarded or defended Nabal's flocks while they were in the wilderness. They performed a service to them. So it doesn't seem too out of bounds then for David to expect something in return, to say, hey, I've done all of this for you. Would you be willing to repay me and my men for our services? That makes more sense to me. Second, Nabal does more than just express unwillingness to feed David. Look with me at verse 10. when David sends this delegation and makes this request, Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is David? Who's the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters." Nabal appears now to have crossed the line to actually be insulting David. It's hard to believe that he doesn't actually know who David is. His wife knows who David is. His wife knows that he's the man who is fighting the Lord's battles. Surely Nabal knows that this is the guy who killed Goliath, right? And what he's doing is showing no regard for David. He's going to pretend like he doesn't know who David is. He says, "Your name essentially means nothing to me. You're no different than the countless other servants who are rebelling against their master these days. You're just some rando dude to me in the wilderness who's coming and making a request of me that has no bearing in my life. It's falling on deaf ears. David, no, I'm not going to help you out." I think we know that this is an insult by David's response. When word makes it back to David what Nabal had replied, "Who's David? Who's the son of Jesse?" David doesn't sit there and think, "Well, maybe I should have told him my last name because there's a lot of Davids and he just actually doesn't know who I am." No, David tells his men, "Everybody strap on your sword. We're going to Nabal's house and killing everybody." David knows exactly what Nabal is doing here. He has been insulted and he's on his way to do just that when Abigail meets him on the path. Abigail had heard from another servant about how her husband had responded to David's men. The servant says to her, "Your husband is such a worthless man that people can't even speak to him. Abigail, you need to figure out what to do here because our lives are in danger." So Abigail acts quickly and she assembles what seems to be a fair amount of food. She gets 200 loaves of bread, I would assume, a couple of skins of wine, 100 clusters of raisins, 5 sheep, almost 10 gallons of grain, 200 cakes of figs. The reason I mention the quantity here is that it's not like Nabal didn't have food lying around. This is what Abigail is able to gather quickly. She's able to get this much food. I don't know if this can feed 600 men or not, but certainly there are supplies on hand that could have helped David and his men out, and Nabal is just refusing. It's not for lack of food in his house. Abigail meets David on the way, and her interaction with him is really noteworthy. First, she takes responsibility on herself. She says to David, even though she had nothing to do with her husband's reaction, she says, "Let this guilt be on me. Please forgive me for my trespass." This is a really generous response. Given who her husband is, I might have been inclined to take a step back and say, "Well, I'm going to let my husband deal with his words, and I'll make sure that I'm innocent in this matter." She doesn't do that. Really generous response there. Then she views herself as having been sent by Yahweh to actually save David from doing something stupid. In verse 26, she says that Yahweh has restrained David from blood guilt and from saving with his own hand. She says something in verse 31 that is very similar. I actually want us to look at verse 31. Her response to David is incredible here. She is talking to David about his future when he will become king. She says, "My Lord," speaking to David, "you shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord," also David, "working salvation for himself." I don't want you to miss what she's saying here. She's essentially saying this: David, if you had gone through with your plan to kill my husband, you may have looked back on this day with regret. Your conscience might bother you for your actions on this day. Think about it. Someone insulted you, and how did you respond? You killed him. Did you really want to be king someday and have that on your record? Do you really want to be known as the guy who, when you receive an insult, responds with killing them? When David hears this, he's like, "Wow, thank you so much, Lord, for sending this woman my way. Through this lady, you have saved me from doing something incredibly foolish." He thanks The Lord, Abigail's counsel is to let God provide deliverance. And sure enough, within 2 weeks, Nabal is dead. And it's not random death either. The text tells us that the Lord struck him down. Again, David praises the Lord here for avenging this insult. Now Abigail is a widow, and David marries her. I mean, this is a woman of great character, very noteworthy in the scriptures for her character, and she would make an excellent wife, just given what we know about her. As our second question, I asked you to use this as a guide to help you evaluate the extent that these attributes may or may not be present in your own life. So I had a series of questions for you just to consider as you think about the story of Nabal and Abigail that I hope are thought-provoking, that I hope draw out some of the character traits that should or should not be part of our life. Here's the first question. Do you use your words as a weapon? Or do you use them to make peace? Are you more like Nabal or Abigail in this regard? How do you use your tongue? Trying to stir up strife or calming things down? Second, how do you respond to insults? When people insult you, do you take matters into your own hands like David was about to do? Or do you trust the Lord to say, I'll take care of it? Do we remember that vengeance is the Lord's? How about this one? Are you humble enough to recognize how other people have helped you? And are you willing to return the favor, so to speak? Are you willing to be generous to people who have been kind to you? Or are you always on the receiving end of things? Always hoarding, taking for yourself, never looking out for other people? How about this one? Can people talk to you and know that you will hear them out? Remember, Nabal was described as being a worthless man because no one could talk to him? Are we like that? Do we just kind of get so laser focused in on my way or the highway that other people try to reason with us and we just don't listen to them? We should seriously look at the attributes of Nabal and Abigail here and do some soul searching and say, Lord, please help me not to be like Nabal. Using my tongue as a weapon, being a fool, not being generous, not able to be spoken to. I was reminded of, I believe it's James 3, one of the fruits of godly wisdom is that you are open to reason. We should be like this. In 1 Samuel 26, David has another opportunity to kill Saul in this chapter. This time it's not in a cave. This time Saul is asleep on the ground. Actually, Saul and all of his men are asleep. That seems incredibly strange to us. How is it that Saul and every single person with him could be asleep right now? Surely someone would be awake as a guard. But the text tells us the Lord had actually caused all of these people to be asleep. That makes a little bit more sense to us. So David and one of his soldiers are able to waltz right into Saul's camp, get right up next to Saul, where his spear is driven into the ground next to his head, and the guy with him, his name is Abishai, he says to David, David, let me at him. All I need is one swing. I'm not even going to need two. This will be over before you know it. Again, David says, no, we're not going to put out our hand against the Lord's anointed. How would you describe David's reasoning for letting Saul go in verses 10 and 11? Cynthia.
So Saul is the Lord's anointed, the chosen one. So the Lord should determine how he should die.
Yes, the Lord should determine how Saul should die, not David. Look at verses 10 and 11. We'll just read them really quick. David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But take now the spear that is at his head and the jar of water, and let us go. What David is saying here is, again, what we said already today. This is the guy that God has made king. It is not my job to end his reign prematurely. Saul's day will eventually come. Maybe that's in battle. Maybe it'll be natural causes. Maybe even the Lord will strike him down. I'm just not going to be the one to do it. This is remarkable character from David here. Imagine what he stands to gain if Saul dies. He can just tell his family, hey, pack your bags. We're moving to the castle. I'm king now. We don't need to run anymore. There's my throne. Life is good. How many of us would have let this soldier take out Saul? How many of us would maybe have just turned around and said, well, I didn't really see anything. I wasn't the one who did it exactly. I'm not guilty. Not David. He says, no, we are not going to touch the Lord's anointed. Question for you, what lesson can we learn from David's example here? I think there's a couple. Any thoughts on this? What did we learn, Claire? God is always in control of our situation. Yeah, Brenda, I saw your hand raised as well.
God has a plan, and we should respect God and not take matters into our own hands.
Yeah, I think you hit several good ideas. God has a plan. We should respect his authority, not take matters into our own hands. Yeah, any other thoughts? Orvin? Yeah, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. I will repay. Totally. David is trusting God here. I think you guys hit the ones that I'm about to talk about here. First, one of the lessons we can learn is that we need to trust God's timing of events. Is it possible that there are circumstances in our life where we are tempted to take matters into our own hands to try and work out the outcome that we want? We have this idea in our minds of how we would like things to go and the pace at which they should happen. And as we're going about life and things seems to be going slower than we wanted or different than we wanted, we might be inclined to take matters into our own hands and try to produce the outcome that we want. Essentially, we're saying, I'm going to be in control here. I determine when these things happen in my life. I want you to think about this for just a second here. If David had taken Saul's life, there's kind of two sins or two components to what's going on here. First, we would say the easy one is that David's murdering him. But I think there's more to it than that. If David had killed Saul, I think he would be demonstrating contempt for God's choice and God's timing. David essentially would have been saying, Lord, I know what you have promised me. I know where I'm going here. I want to be king right now. So I'm taking Saul out and doing things my way. I don't trust your plan. Could I encourage you, from David's example, to wait on God's timing in your life? I'm not saying be passive. I'm not saying sit on the couch and wonder, why am I not getting a job? Why am I not getting married? Why is all these things not happening to me? Certainly not. But I am encouraging you to trust God's timing, particularly with things that you cannot control or should not be controlling. With David, it was the issue of murder, right? To take Saul's life here would have been murder. It would have been contempt for God's plan. Maybe for you and I, we might be tempted to be dishonest in the workplace for our own gain, disregarding what God has said. Saying, I know this is the pace at which my life is going, but I'm going to be dishonest to either accelerate the path that I am on in my company, to get personal gain from my dishonesty here. We might disregard God's instruction on marriage, overlooking what he has said about who is eligible for us to marry, or really the permanence of marriage, saying to ourselves, well, I know what God has said, but I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to look outside of the scope of people that I otherwise could because I really want to be married. Our culture is doing this as well. They are demonstrating that they think they know better than God in determining the gender they want to be. Right now, me and Pastor John were talking this week, there are people who are trying to be in control of even when they die. Mankind always wants to be in control. And like David, we need to yield to God, to his timing, to his process, to be like David and say, I could step out of bounds here and maybe accelerate things, but I am going to trust the Lord. Let him take care of it. I want to make one other observation about David's interactions with Saul here, and that is this. David does more than just spare Saul's life. He actually respects the office that Saul holds as king. We might think to ourselves that David might say to Saul, well, you're lucky I didn't kill you, but I'm still going to trash talk you. I'm still going to slander you when given the opportunity, but that's not what David does. In the times that we see him interact with Saul, he's not proud. He doesn't slander him. He doesn't say, like I just said a minute ago, you're lucky I didn't kill you. Back in chapter 24, when David comes out of the cave and reveals to Saul what he had done, David bows down. He calls Saul his father. He's very humble in the conversation. Here in chapter 26, he calls Saul his Lord or his master. He refers to himself as Saul's servant. For you and I, let's be respectful of people who hold leadership positions. It might be very obvious to us that they aren't doing very good at their job. We might disagree with them. We might even know that they aren't good people. But we need to remember, as Romans 13 tells us, that these people have been appointed by God. That God in his sovereignty has allowed them to come into the office that they hold. Paul, in Romans 13, when talking about this, first talks about owing taxes and revenue to our leaders. Then Paul follows that up by saying that we should give respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. There are people around us today who seemingly have no problem making derogatory or unkind comments about our leaders. And I would encourage you to evaluate if you are letting the culture influence what you say, or if you are letting the scriptures influence what you say. And David's example here, not to be someone who just derides Saul, even though he was a bad king. We know this. He's not a godly man. But David is respectful. He's humble. He's submissive to this ungodly king. That should be an example to us today. We didn't have a question from chapter 27, but it is kind of necessary to understand what's going on in this chapter so that we can continue the story. David again flees to Philistine territory. He's done this once before. We were kind of scratching our heads the last time, but he's back in Philistia, fleeing from Saul. He goes to Gath again. It's like, oh my goodness, why do you keep going to Gath? And he becomes an ally of sorts to the Philistines. It's kind of strange. I don't think any of us would ever think that David and the Philistines would be allies, but they are. He employs an interesting strategy. He attacks Canaanite cities and then reports back to the king of Gath and says, I attacked Judah today. I attacked some of their allies. And he actually tricks the king of Gath into thinking that they are buddy-buddy, that they are on the same team here. One of the commentators, I believe, said something like, David is actually continuing the conquest of the land that Joshua had started by attacking these Canaanite cities here. He's kind of fulfilling what God had told the people to do here. So he fools the king so much that when the Philistines go to battle against the Israelites, the king of the Philistines says, David, you're joining me. Let's go fight against Israel. And we're like, what in the world? I cannot imagine a scenario in which David would actually fight against his own people here. But the king thinks David has made a stench of himself to these people. He's on my side now because of what he's telling me he's been doing. So we kind of get an inside look at what's going on in the Philistine army when they come to battle against the Israelites. Chapter 28 largely gives us Saul's perspective. We have an inside look at what's happening in both camps of the armies here. We're wondering to ourselves, okay, I know what David's up to. He's an ally of the Philistines now. What's Saul up to these days? Well, in chapter 28, Saul hears that the Philistines are gathering against him. He and the people are absolutely terrified. And to his credit, he inquires of the Lord, maybe asking what to do or what the outcome will be. The only problem is that when he inquires of God, nothing. God does not answer. No prophets, no dreams, crickets. We might think to ourselves, Saul, I think from my perspective, you're doing the right thing here. You are actually seeking God in time of distress. So, God, why are you ignoring Saul? Maybe that question came to mind this week, but I think verse 16 helps us to answer that question. How does verse 16 help to answer why God turned away from Saul? What's going on here that we need to know about? Kaylee? Yeah, the Lord had torn the kingdom from Saul. If you're looking at verse 16, Samuel says to Saul, "Why do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy?" Now God's silence is starting to make more sense to us. God and Saul are enemies. And Kaylee just told us that God had actually ripped the kingdom from Saul. How did Saul get in this position according to verse 18? Barb?
I'm just thinking, too little too late at this point, Now you're turning to God after all of this.
Yeah.
He's turning back.
Yeah, you actually kind of quoted what a couple of people I read in preparation for this said, that if Saul isn't going to listen to God, then God isn't going to listen to Saul. Yeah, remember the specific event, though, that kind of necessitated this in verse 18? Cynthia?
That when he's supposed to kill all the people and he didn't.
Yeah, back in chapter 15, God had told Saul, wipe out the Amalekites in their entirety. Samuel comes, why do I still hear the bleating of the sheep? Why is Agag still alive? You have disobeyed God, Saul. He's tearing the kingdom from you. I wanted us to consider that this idea of being God's enemy is not just an Old Testament concept. The New Testament also speaks about how a person can be the enemy of God. In James 4:4, we're told, you adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Is this language kind of surprising to you? I don't think it's too often that we stop and think about God being our enemy, and yet here in this text of Scripture, we're told explicitly it's very possible that God could be your enemy. Just a little bit later, I believe in the same chapter of James, we read that God opposes the proud. You want God in opposition to you? Be proud. There's another passage of Scripture in 1 Peter chapter 3, where husbands are warned to live with their wives in an understanding way, otherwise their prayers may be hindered. Here's the point that I'm trying to make this morning. It is possible, very possible, that God could be in opposition to you, that God would refuse to listen to your prayers, even today, that God might be your enemy. So verses like these should cause us to pause and evaluate our lives, asking ourselves this question: how much am I a friend of the world? Do I love the ungodly culture around me? If so, think about how you've aligned yourself then against God. We should ask ourselves, am I proud? That's an easy one. If you are proud, God is opposed to you. That there is no grace available, James says, to proud people. Wonder why your prayers aren't getting answered? Peter would say, how's your relationship with your wife? We just need to consider that, yeah, Saul is an enemy of God. It's possible that we could put ourselves in this position as well by loving the world, by being proud people. At the end, or somewhere in chapter 28, I don't have the verse right in front of me here, but Samuel is talking to Saul. I forgot to mention that Samuel is actually dead in this conversation. Saul is not allowed. Saul goes and finds a medium. Since he can't hear from God, he says, okay, I guess I'll go talk to a medium. And this woman is allowed to, I don't know, get Samuel present in some form, and Samuel reiterates, some of what we've talked about and tacks on, by tomorrow, Saul, you're dead. You and your sons are going to be joining me, actually. It's like, whoa, these are probably not the words that Saul wanted to hear when he was just trying to figure things out here. This goes pretty poorly for him from our perspective. Chapter 29 brings us back over to the Philistine army. Remember, David is living among the Philistines. He's expected to actually fight with them against Israel. And it seems like he was totally prepared to go along with this plan until some of the Philistine commanders see David and they're like, what's he doing here? Why is David in our group right now? They say to the king or the commander of the army, they say, don't you think David would like nothing more than to turn on us in battle and bring our heads to Saul as some sort of like peace offering? Isn't this guy, David, the one of whom the ladies were singing, David has killed his 10,000s? We're really letting this guy march out to battle with us right now? And the king of Gath goes, okay, David, you seem like a nice guy to me, but the other Philistines don't want you here, so could you just like pack up and go home? I do wonder if this is actually God's sovereignty or providence in allowing David to escape perhaps this difficult situation. I think there's even more going on here, which we'll see in just a second, but I'm also kind of inclined to think that the Philistine commanders might have been onto something. I suspect David may have turned on his allies in the battle if he had actually gone through with this here. So David gets sent home back to this city named Ziklag, only to find that something has happened in their absence. What happens to the city of Ziklag while David and his army are away? Diane? Yeah, the Amalekites had come to the city of Ziklag and burned it to the ground and taken everything with them. Family, livestock, they took it with them. The Amalekites are opportunists. I mean, all the men are gone. Hey, easy city, let's go attack it. Let's get ourselves wealthy off of this. Can you imagine coming home to something like this? Maybe seeing smoke on the horizon. You know Ziklag is in that direction. You're David and his men. Oh my goodness, why do I see smoke coming up from that area right now? Your pace probably picks up. You're hurrying to get back to the city. You crest a hill only to see your city, where your kids, your wives, everything razed to the ground. We're told that the people are they're weeping. David himself is weeping, even more than weeping. David is distressed for another reason. According to verse 6, what do the men want to do to David? I heard someone whisper it. Stone him. Yeah, these guys want to stone David, perhaps for negligence, thinking to themselves, okay, David, you shouldn't have brought all 600 with us. Leave somebody behind to protect Ziklag while we're gone. Now their anger, their frustration is taken out on David. How does David respond here at the end of verse 6? What's he do when confronted with this just overwhelming oppression? Yeah, Cynthia. He strengthens himself in the Lord. Remember Jonathan had previously done this for David when he was in the wilderness? Now David's doing this for himself. This is in keeping with what we have seen in David's life throughout this study. If Saul tries to kill David in his own house, when Doeg tells Saul that Ahimelech has helped him, when the Philistine sees him, when his own army threatens him, David turns to the Lord. In every circumstance, he's always turning back to God. And I wonder if David recognized God's sovereignty at this moment in his life. Think about this. If the Philistine army hadn't sent him home, he's not going to find out that Ziklag has been destroyed until much later. Maybe he recognized, wow, God sent me home so I could rescue my loved ones. Let's see. We're almost running out of time. I'm trying to figure out where we should end off here. All right, let's skip ahead to chapter 31. In chapter 31, very quickly, Saul and his sons are killed in battle, as Samuel had said would happen. Jonathan, he's killed. Saul, he's badly wounded. He asks his armor bearer to kill him. His armor bearer refuses, so Saul actually ends up taking his own life. And we're just kind of left with kind of a bitter end to Saul's story. Here's a man who had so much, equipped with the Spirit of God, surrounded by men of valor, now dying on the battlefield, the enemy of God. Word makes it back to David that Saul has been killed. How might we expect David to respond at the news of Saul's death? Brenda? Expect him to be relieved? Yeah. Any other thoughts or emotions that you might expect David to have? Barb? Happy? Totally. Yeah. Diane? No more fear. Yeah, I think you guys are getting how I would feel. I'd be like, wow, King David has a nice ring to it. I'm the guy now. Let's celebrate. My enemy, the guy who's been breathing down my neck, is dead. How does David actually respond here? Yeah. Yeah. He mourns, he weeps. The text tells us he tears his clothes. He fasts, he writes a lament that remembers Saul and Jonathan. And maybe as you read the lament this week, you found yourself thinking, well, that's pretty generous to Saul. I mean, this is David's opportunity to write like some slam poetry about Saul, but he doesn't. Here's just an excerpt from what he said about Saul from verses 23 and 24. He says, Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and death, they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. You daughters of Saul, or you daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. This is not exactly the opinion that I would have had of Saul, even just reading his story. David is incredibly gracious here. One of the things that stands out to me is that David maintains his position that the Lord's anointed is deserving of respect and should be protected. Maybe we'll come back to this next week and just kind of revisit some more of the circumstances surrounding Saul's death. But let me just encourage you with this final verse on the screen here. We're reminded of Jesus' exhortation to us, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. We would be wise to respond like David did and like Jesus commands us to people who are our enemies. Let's pray. Lord, please, this is very difficult for us, what we are considering right now. It goes against our nature to be kind to people who are our enemies. To be this gracious as we're seeing David be here is unfathomable. Through your help, through your Spirit, would you help us to respond this way to people who annoy us, who've maybe done unkind and wrong things to us? Would you help us to be loving, to even pray for those who are our enemies? And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.